Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our discussion on return to school planning. I'm Yomika Bennett, Executive Director of the New York Charter Schools Association. We're going to jump right in today, and joining me today are Susie Carello, Executive Director of SUNY Charter Schools Institute. Hi, Susie. David Frank, Executive Director of Charter Schools Office at New York State Education Department. And Daly Matos, Executive Director, Policy and Operations at New York City Department of Education. Aaron Cochran, Manager Director in the same office. Laurie Hazeley, Senior Director, Charter Authorizing and Accountability at DOE. And Corey Callahan from the New York City Charter Center. Welcome all. As you know, the New York State Department of Health, New York State Education Department, and SUNY Charter Schools Institute has each issued guidance that requires schools' attention and response on reopening planning. Schools need to be aware and comply with the requirements of each of the relevant state entities. One thing to do for sure is to make sure you have designated the responsible party in accordance with DOH guidelines, which applies to all schools. The responsible party is responsible for affirming the DOH guidance have been read and understood, and that the plan developed will adhere to the guidance. The responsible party will also be responsible, according to the DOH guidance, for meeting those standards. All schools are required to submit their plan and affirmation to New York State DOH. You could think of this as the governor's plan, possibly. Schools would also need to submit your plans to New York State Education Department or SUNY, along with any additional information they may require, and of course we'll talk a lot more about that. In accordance with DOH requirements, plans must be developed with the engagement of stakeholders and community members, which includes, among others, students, parents and legal guardians, faculty, staff, local health departments, and community organizations. Your plans must be posted on your website, and they are due July 31st. Now, that is my very brief overview of some of the highlights of the requirements for the reopening. The guidance documents are posted on each of the relevant entities' website. That's New York State Department of Health, New York State Education Department, and SUNY Charter Schools Institute. We will drop links in the chat, but more importantly, we have here with us today the experts in the room, David Frank and Susie Carello. Thank you again for joining us today. The way I think of these different guidance documents is DOH interim guidance lays out the minimum standards, practices, and protocols aimed at protecting the public health. So they talk mostly about face masks, social distancing, screening, facility use, cleanings, closure triggers, etc. SUNY guidance details what's required for all of that and spells out what policies, procedures, and protocols should be included in the plan, as well as instructional matters, calendars, enrollment, attendance, curriculum, etc. The SED guidance that was just recently released, and we have not had a chance to read that in detail. We're dropping a link to that in the chat as well. Guidance just came out for that. But I'm sure David will speak about what's more of the details that are included in their guidance as we turn it over to the authorizers for our updates and questions. For questions today, we will start with the questions we did not get to on Tuesdays. Any questions we do not get to, we will cover in our next webinar, which right now we're planning for possibly Tuesday, so stay tuned on that. If you have questions, just as Becky posted in the chat, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. That is the only way everyone will be able to see the questions, and we can get them in the queue to be asked and answered. And with all of that, Susie, Laurie, and David, welcome. Susie, we'll start with you. SUNY released guidance today that is specifically for SUNY-authorized schools. As part of your update, can you give us an overview of what that guidance includes and what SUNY-authorized schools should see as next steps?
Absolutely. Thanks, Yomika. Really appreciate the time to at least speak to folks and have them react with some questions. But as always in this whole process, if the answers are unclear or they don't seem like they apply to a particular challenge or situation that you're having with your school or EdCorp, please reach out to the Institute. We really, it is the thing we can do to really help you, is help kind of navigate through at least some of the reporting requirements. And, you know, Yomika was very kind to call us the experts, but you are the experts about your schools. And that's, I'm sure, part of the reason that the planning structure was set up the way it was by the Department of Health and the governor's office. So our guidance includes quite substantively the information that is required from the plan through the DOH portal. If you read through the guidance, it indicates pretty clearly that there is a component that we build into our plan that would allow you to PDF all of the materials you're going to use and submit that through the portal, submit it to us, and we'll make sure that if David in the State Education Department wants to see them, they're all going to be on your websites anyway, but we're happy to aggregate them up and take that step out of your responsibility basket because we know you're really focusing on students. I think one other just thing to underscore again, we understand that there are the substantive part of what we're asking for are the materials that are required under the DOH plan. That encompasses response 2 if you look at the way things are laid out. For the remainder of the responses, and we've noted that in there, if you already have plans, and most of you have shared plans with me around what you think a schedule is going to look like, around what you think your school calendar is going to look like, you should feel free to direct us to the right spot in that plan, attach the plan you already have to the overall package, and then we can look through and see the materials that we're interested, that were in addition to what the DOH asked for. So we tried to make it as streamlined as possible. And we wanted to put a link in to what the Regents came out with. We did send you to their splash page where I know they've got the link. I saw it earlier today. And David, I had a chance to quickly look through it in the last hour or so. And I think, honestly, as we say in our document, there's some really interesting advice and thoughtful considerations in there. And so, David, I know we'll go through that, but we would encourage SUNY schools to read through that. And to the extent it's helpful, please feel free, obviously, to include all of the good resources that you can have access to. That's it for me.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll go now to Laurie. I know you have a couple updates for DOE authorized schools. Can you share those as well as any other updates you might have?
Sure, absolutely. So good afternoon, everyone. First, I apologize. Tuesday, I dropped off. We are still adjusting to being back working and taking care of 2 very young children. I had a perfect storm of miscommunication, but for full transparency, I cannot promise that that will not happen again. So I ask you all to bear with me. So I want to clarify, so a clarification from Tuesday as well as an announcement. So on Tuesday, I said we would be coming out with some guidance, and let me be more precise with my language. We are not coming out with guidance for DOE authorized schools. What I meant was that we would be sending out some clarifying instructions for submission, namely for DOE authorized schools, 1, to follow NICED and DOH guidance, 2, as already has been said, submit in 2 places, the DOH link and the NICED portal, not in CHIP, which you all know as the Charter Information Portal, post them online. Of course, 3, we are also, the DOE is going to be asking for your calendar as DOE authorized schools. Please make sure there is a link to your updated calendar and that that's posted online, and notify us if you have any changes to your calendar. And 4, that we will be reviewing and following up with schools on your reopening plans. So that is, those are the, I'll send the email out with that, but that is the clarifying instructions for DOE authorized schools. The second item is an announcement, again, for DOE authorized schools. The updated accountability calendar is forthcoming. It will be virtually the same as last year with one notable change. We are asking to see your board approved budgets ahead of our typical October 2nd deadline. And in addition, we'll be asking you to complete a budget narrative. And I thank my colleagues at SUNY for the work you all did on creating your budget narrative and allowed me to beg, borrow, steal that. Use your good thinking. Ours is very similar to yours. Next week, I'll send an email out to DOE authorized schools with the updated deadline. We will give you 4 full weeks from when I send out the email to submit your board approved budgets and the budget narrative. you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll respond to them in the email that goes out to DOE authorized schools next week.
Great, thank you, Laurie. Hi, David. Do you have an update for us?
Hey, Amika. Yeah, so we have our 145-page guidance that was just emailed out to all charter schools, and I put another link in the chat for it. It actually has a ton of information in it. The guiding principles for that document are really the health, safety, and well-being of all children and adults, ensuring that equity is at the forefront of all of our decision-making, but also realizing that there is no one-size-fits-all, that each LEA is going to need to develop a plan that meets the unique challenges and needs of your students and staff. And so there's a lot of guidance in there. Our document actually has, each section has two components. One are reopening mandatory requirements, and this is taken from the governor's guidance through the DOH, local codes, whether it's fire or health and building codes, as well as the education law. And then the other component of the guidance are considerations for reopening plans. And so see this as effective practices, more or less. There are 9 areas that are covered in the guidance: health and safety, transportation, facilities, nutrition, teaching and learning, digital equity and access, budget and fiscal, social emotional needs, special education, bilingual ed, and then staffing and human resources. So there's a lot of information in there. We've sent, as I've said, we've sent out the guidance to every school in the state of New York: district, charter, parochial, independent. We even mailed hard copies to the Amish schools that don't necessarily have internet connection. And so every school has it. We hope that it's a resource. We will be following up in the next day or so with a link to our. The portal is going to have attestations for schools to complete. There's actually about 50 of them, and these all come from the required mandates. It's basically yes, no. Are you, for example, in your plan, do you commit to having a protocol for hand hygiene, for wearing masks? Do you, are you going to adhere to the education law, things of that nature? And then there's a space for a link for you to put, as I mentioned on Tuesday, for you to put your plan. We're not actually asking for a Word document, but rather just a link to your website where you're required to post the plan, or it could be a Google Drive, although one of the attestations is, did you post the plan on your website? And we expect that these plans are living, breathing documents, that you'll change them. And that's why we're asking for a link and not the actual document. So hopefully the link will be evergreen that you share. It will, that when you make changes, you can make it right on the version that's on that link. And so we don't need to ask you for it again. But we don't know what the future will hold, and we fully expect that schools might have a plan to go fully remote today, and that might change to a hybrid model, or there might be a hybrid model that changes to a fully remote plan based on how the pandemic proceeds. So we know that these plans are flexible and changeable. We also hope that, I had the pleasure of spending the morning briefly with the West Buffalo Charter School talking about, and it was a convening of their teachers and stakeholders regarding their pre-opening plan and how they're going to work over the next 2 weeks. And as Mika said, the plans are due on the 31st of July. Made a plan together as a community. And we hope similarly that schools across the state will involve their community in developing these plans, however you define your community to be. But in general, that's our plan. I would also want to mention that yesterday we put out some guidance, a memo to the field regarding special education funding. The funding, the link to the memo, and I'll post it. It's up on our website. But the general gist of the memo is that in the 1920 school year, if you had students with disabilities in your school, but you weren't able to meet all the requirements of the IEP, you should still receive payment for those students. There are some caveats, there are some exceptions in there, but in general, we want to make sure that schools are able to provide best faith efforts to ensure that some of our state's most vulnerable students with disabilities, are served, even in the face of a pandemic, without financial loss. So I will send around a link for that memo, but that's my update for now.
Okay, great, and thank you. That was an excellent point about what West Buffalo is doing in engaging the community. I will point out DOH is, for everyone, page 17 talks about what responsible parties have to do, and one of the things they must do is they must engage the school stakeholders. And your plans for reopening, again, the plans that submitted per DOH's requirements, require that you identify the groups of people involved and engaged throughout the planning process. So that's very important to do. I have a couple questions that I want to talk about in terms of thinking about what's submitted where. So I'm going to ask the question this way. What, and this is for both Susie and David, what are we submitting and to where? To who gets what? If you could tell me, Susie, what should school submit to you? David, what should school submit to you? And both of you, what do how does that comport with what they submit to DOH? If you could just tell us that, and then schools, as you're talking, can sort of jot down so they know where to send whatever they need to send. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Right.
So I'll dive in for the SUNY schools. So submit your plan to us once. If you are a multi-school ed corporation, we just want your plan once. If you are also responsible for submitting, you can submit the same plan to the Department of Health through the governor's portal. That link is all over our document in many places to make it convenient for you to reference it, but also know where you need to submit. Can submit the same plan, but they are asking for a plan for each school. And so it may be that if you have 3 schools in your education corporation, as long as the plan that you've created for us addresses what's happening at those 3 schools, you may have to submit it 3 times, but you can submit that plan.
Okay, great. David?
Yeah, so echoing what Susie said, every charter school needs to submit a plan to the Department of Health. That's an important step. So don't forget that step. And the memo that the governor sent was previously shared. And Yumika or Rebecca, if you can share that link, that would be helpful, I'm sure. Then there's, and so we are sending out our guidance to every charter school in the state. And at the end of the day, if you would like to share your plan with the state education department, that would be, and share the work that you're doing. All we're asking for is a link. So it wouldn't be unwelcome. But certainly for Board of Regents authorized schools, Buffalo authorized schools, and New York City DOE authorized schools, you are required to go to the SED portal and submit your plan through SED. There's no carve out in the governor's memo contrary to that. But we will send out both documents to all charter schools, both the guidance as well as the link to SED's portal.
Okay. So So, and I'm gonna run through this again because I have a feeling this is because of the questions that I received that people might want to hear this again. So I'm going to try to wrap this up, and you correct me if I got this wrong. So New York State DOH has its own submission. I'll call it a portal, right? And that we can find that that information is included in New York State Department of Health guidelines, their interim guidelines, their documents. We will drop that information again in the chat, and that is the plan that I refer to as the governor's plan, because that's the one he talks about and came out through the governor's website. So that plan has to be submitted through their portal, through their website. New York State DOH that's where the DOH plan goes to. SUNY, you have a separate portal to submit plans. That's through which schools should submit plans. That's Epicenter. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay. So that's Epicenter, and that information is also in your guidance. You'll see that, and you also again point schools back to what they should do to submit the DOH's plan and how the two plans can talk to each other. Okay. And David, you for SED. The portal will be up on Friday. In your guidance, you have your portal information where schools will submit their attestations and as well as provide the links to their plans. Is that right? And then they should also, and you expect as well that and remind schools in your documents that they should submit to the governor/DOH website as well.
That's right.
Did I get that all right?
An easy way to remember this for schools is everyone is going to the DOH website and submitting a plan. I think Susie actually made a very good point before that I think is worth repeating. You don't need to create two plans. You can submit the same plan in both places. Just make sure the plans meet all the criteria. And then for SUNY schools, you're required to go through SUNY. But we're going to send out our link to all schools. We hope that they're good resources and help inform your practice.
Okay. All right. So you're recommending read all the plans, submit where you should, and make sure if you don't do anything else, well, make sure you do this. In addition to everything else, you absolutely have to all schools also send to DOH.
Right. One plan. That's all you need to create. One plan.
All right. One plan. Very good. I would complicate that with a question, but I won't. I'm going to move on to the next. And thank you again very much for that. So diving in right now to the other questions, and we have them grouped thematically. David, Susie, Laurie, please feel free to weigh in. First, the question is regarding at-risk staff. What recommendations do you have for schools about how to define, determine, and accommodate at-risk staff?
Mika, do you mind really quickly, Laurie, can you go through what DOE's authorized schools have to do for the submissions of their plans?
Sure. So DOE authorized schools should be submitting via the DOH link as well as the NYSED link, and are not submitting to CHIP or any other place. So two places for DOE schools. And I agree fully and reiterate what Susie and David Frank said about one plan.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to then just make sure I have that right. So DOE schools, repeat that again. DOE authorized schools, please repeat that.
Yes, so they will submit their plan on the DOH link as well as through the NYSED portal. And that is it. No DOE portal through those two places.
Okay, very good. All right, we'll go back to the question regarding at-risk staff. Laurie, do you want to start?
Sure. So I would say, so recommendations for schools. Might see what my legal would allow me to say here. One, so I heard that the center is doing a webinar on this. I can't recommend or not recommend it, but I heard that the center is doing a webinar on it. So I would say that. I heard that. And I would definitely recommend that schools are consulting with their with their attorneys. And to make sure, I would encourage you and ensure that your policies are well documented and clear to your staff. That is what I can say at this point.
And I can confirm that we are doing a webinar, and I'm putting the registration in the chat if schools are interested in discussing this. We'll be doing it in collaboration with the law firm Barton Gilman, who I know for the New York City charter schools, a lot of schools are familiar with them. So please join us. That will be next Tuesday.
My recommendation to schools is that that's a very sensitive area, and you need to have buy-in for your teachers. You need to develop a plan. This is not, this is a lot of times you just probably want to be told what to do, but you need to develop a plan that works for your community. And there are a lot of sensitivities right now about safety, health and safety. So this is a moment that takes real leadership. And what are you going to do as a school to ensure that people feel safe, but also that the very real health concerns that teachers have are addressed. We know that many of our teachers have underlying health conditions, that some of them have long commutes to school, and that that doesn't mean that you can not require them to come in, but it also means that you should take that into consideration. But other than that, I would say that each school needs to do what they feel is best for their community, and also taking into account the research that's coming out about the efficacy of schooling on the social emotional well-being of students. It's a real concern, and it's a concern not only for your schools, but in district schools and across the country.
I'll echo what my colleagues said. The great council at SUNY we all thank the center for holding the session that they have advertised, because we think it'll allow us to understand more of the questions. So we're hoping to listen in. But you all have attorneys that can help you kind of navigate what those issues are for your particular setting. And I think, just to add on a little bit to what David said, a large part of this is comfort. And your teachers are now conceptualizing something that is still unknown. They kind of know your space, but they don't understand what the volume of people will look like moving past each other, access to all of the protective pieces that we know we all want them to have readily available. So it is a moment where we're going to all start having to get used to managing our way through the unknown. And then as they get more comfortable with it, I think we've had this experience on our team. As we get more comfortable, it seems a little bit more doable. We're here to be a sounding board or to share ideas at any time.
Great. The next question, or group of questions, I should say, we received were about 180-day waivers and funding. We can't, of course, predict what the governor will do if a region cannot open and can't meet the requirements. But what about charter schools that elect to provide remote instruction, or if some grades or students are fully remote or not others? Do you have any thoughts about what that means for 180-day waivers and funding?
Yeah, so I can take that one, or take a first stab. So the regents have a waiver of instructional hour requirements pertaining to the 900 or 990 hour requirements and the 180-day requirements for state aid purposes. And those regulatory flexibilities are continuing through the 2021 school year. And the regents made that announcement at the July regents meeting. It seems like it was weeks ago, but it was on Monday. And so there will continue to be flexibilities. I would say stay tuned, but we also hope that the special education memo that we sent out yesterday, is of help, and expect that that guidance will be updated as we head into the 2021 school year. But schools, as is stated in our guidance, schools will have the flexibility to start off the 2021 school year with the option of fully remote, fully in person, or a hybrid of both. And that decision is up to you as the LEA. You certainly have the flexibilities to choose one of the three without fear of losing funding. I would take a look at that special ed memo though, and realize that there are certain ramifications for not providing in-person supports, particularly for students either they have an IEP for the first time during the pandemic, or two, that their IEP has been amended to increase services during the pandemic. And I would be happy to talk to anyone further offline about that. And I'll resend that special education memo. I'll link to it in the chat.
Okay, great. Susie, Laurie, would you like to add anything to that question? Okay. There are a lot of questions also about how and when to decide to transition to fully remote instruction if a case of COVID is diagnosed or suspected. Our interpretation of the guidance is that, as it stands, leaves determination to need to close, as well as length of closure, up to individual schools in consultation with their local Department of Health. Is that also your understanding? What details would you require or recommend schools to include in their plans to address this issue?
I can dive in on this one, David, and if I missed something, let me know. So the guidance does say that actually asks for kind of how you'll report and what the DOH, for the DOH guidance that came out through the governor's office does ask what you'll report, what information you'll gather. And so as I've had some individual conversations with some of you, have said, you need to have protocols that understand who's being cohorted with what group of humans. And if one of them is diagnosed or suspected, that you would contact the local Department of Health, and that they would then help you with the kind of determination about contact tracing, et cetera, and make some, and again, provide you with some analysis as to the best thinking about closing or going fully remote.
So our guidance says that, and it's, basically exactly what Susie said, but our guidance says that schools are required to have written protocols that comply with CDC guidance, and that students and staff who might become ill are quarantined, and that confirmed cases of COVID-19 are coordinated with the local Department of Health. And the link to the CDC guidance is in the chat. I just put it there. But this is an area that you should coordinate with your local DOH regarding, just as Susie said.
All right, perfect. Laurie, do you want to add anything on that question?
No.
Okay. So regarding now social distancing, the presentation from the Board of, to the Board of Regents on Monday alluded to the flexibility around PE. David, can you speak to this? And then additionally, the DOH guidance seems to indicate that social distancing is not required for certain activities. Is this an accurate read of that? And if so, if you could talk about which activities. Again, these last two questions are for everyone. But the first one for David, can you speak to the flexibility around PE?
Yeah, so our guidance, again, if you quickly thumb through to page 49 of our guidance, there's information on required square footage. I won't read it in depth because you can read it yourselves. Again, that's on page 49 of our guidance. But there are, so we're requiring that there are 6 feet in every direction around students, but there are increased requirements if students are engaged in aerobic activities. So that's actually, I believe it's 12 feet in each direction. But you can refer to our guidance on page 49. I hope is that what you were getting at, Yumika?
Absolutely. And then just so, and for everyone, and for David, if you can follow up in terms of whether or not you wanted anyone add more on that question in terms of activities and distance, Susie or Laurie. Okay.
I mean, I've heard of some schools saying, look, we're going to. I just heard Mayor and Chancellor Carranza today are talking about alternative spaces for schools using places like the Javits Center. But certainly, if you have space outside, that would be fantastic. You can. Your teachers might feel more comfortable. Your parents might feel more comfortable. Of course, I don't know about your part of the state, but it's been pretty hot and humid here, and it seems like that's going to stretch on forever. It might not be conducive to being outside, but we encourage you. There's a lot of information in our guidance about using alternative spaces, your gym, your cafeteria. We expect that meals will be delivered in the classroom. And by expect, I mean schools will probably do that. And so you might want to repurpose some of these spaces so that you can maintain social distancing, even if you can't do so to the extent you want in your classrooms. Think outside the box. I'm planning on, I would love to have class over at Susie's Lake House. It's beautiful there.
I volunteer Albany area charter students to walk David's dog.
That's right.
Yeah, and then clean the mud off of him when he gets out of the lake, right?
That's right.
Okay.
I think the other, Yumika, I would just say, I think the other thing is that there's also an acknowledgement that kids may not always stay 6 feet away from each other in the DOH guidance, which indicates that, so the planning for the square footage, I completely understand, but the logistics of the school day, I always think about, what we could make for our children to wear so that they would be safely away by 6 feet. But there's also information in the DOH guidance from the governor's office that indicates, where that is not practicable, that masks are a part of the solution. And so I just wanted to make sure that I didn't want another question that didn't allow for the use of masks if kids are going to be close together.
All right, great. Thank you for that clarification. Back to just submitting the plans for just a second. A few more questions on that. So one is that on Tuesday there was discussion about the boards needing to be engaged in the creation or review of these plans. Do they need to formally approve them before July 31st? If each of you could just speak to that.
Ideally for SUNY schools, the answer would be yes. They are the board. And I understand that you're remote and that it's July and there hasn't been a lot of time. So I would ask that minimally the chair or an executive committee of the board provide to you their agreement with the plan and understanding of the plan, and that they have reviewed it, and that it be approved if you don't have a board meeting in July, and I also know that that is frequently the case across all of our schools, that they be approved in August. David has talked about, they've put a link in. We assume our schools will update from what the thinking is at the end of July. So I think your boards will have an opportunity to understand those plans pretty thoroughly in the coming school year. So for SUNY authorized schools, minimally, I would like it if at least the executive committee of your board had reviewed them and responded to you that they agreed with them, and then you can put it on a future agenda for them to formally vote on any updates to the plan. So that's the SUNY position on it.
Okay, Laurie, David?
I would support what Susie said, but I would add that we really would like, I think similarly, we really would like boards to be part of that
Yeah.
community that are engaging in this process. And I think, you know, we realize the constraints that people have, but our hope, as Susie said, is that boards will be engaged through some means in order to be part of the process. And they're a very important stakeholder. So, you know, if you can get board approval, that is the best practice.
Yeah, I would agree with both of my colleagues. And if there's any DOE authorized school that is struggling with this, to reach out to me and let's creatively problem solve together.
Okay. I have a question on submitting the plans. Do organizations that have more than one school, do they need to submit a separate plan for each location, or can they submit one plan?
For us, each LEA needs, so for us, each LEA, each charter needs to submit a plan. But I think Susie said this before, the plans might be the same plan. We hope that there's differentiation based on site. So if you have one site that is very different than another, you might want to consider that. But for many education corporations that hold multiple charters, you very well might have the same plan. I see no prohibition towards that. But as Susie said, you might need to submit it 3 times. But certainly, we don't want you to. No one's going to be looking for repetition or plagiarizing. Beg, borrow, steal, use other best practices, and just make sure that you own that plan. And I think the most important components are that the plan just isn't something that's on a shelf, but that your teachers know the protocols, your students know the protocols. Certainly, you know, you're not going to have your students read your plan, but you need to figure out a way to bring that alive to them. Or maybe they will. It would be a great project for your high school students.
Susie, Laurie, do you want to add anything on that?
Just the same answer. If your single plan covers what you're going to do at your elementary site, at your middle school site, at your high school site, then it's one plan. If you have multiple elementary school sites and a couple of middle school sites, and that is all addressed in the plan, it's one plan. Submit that plan to us. But DOH, SUNY is asking for, so just submit it once and tell us all the schools that it covers. DOH is asking for you to submit a plan for every charter that you have the authority to operate that's open and operating.
Okay, great.
If I could just also additionally clarify, only because I'm aware of some schools where it's one charter but multiple physical sites, there are some aspects of the DOH plan where the requirements they're asking you to speak to, so for example, procedures for temperature checks, use of extra physical spaces, might be different based on the physical space. And so in that case, Susie, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, from a SUNY perspective, I think that the DOH guidance would actually require for you to say, even if within one charter, there are these 2 physically separate facilities, if you in this facility need to use the gym or, you know, set up temperature screenings in this certain way, and you're doing it differently at a separate physical site within the same charter, those actually need to be, I think within the DOH portal, you could submit them. So the DOH portal is a series of very short questions and then document uploads. So you could distinguish that in the document upload, but you could not say for this one charter, here's the entire plan, if that charter has multiple different physical sites that have different physical health screening requirements. David, Susie, Laurie, am I understanding that correctly from my reading?
Yeah, if they are distinct, if there's something distinct about a plan under one charter with multiple buildings that you do not address in the plan, which you can address. This building is their elementary building. Here's what we're doing. This building is our high school building, and we're doing these things. You can address those in the same plan, upload that plan twice to the DOH, only send it to SUNY once.
Well, and even with the DOH, my understanding is that because all you're doing is uploading attachments, but within the document, you have to call out any physical difference of facilities, even if they're within the same charter.
Correct.
Okay.
Good job, Anna.
A lot of guidance reading. Laurie, David, anything to add? Am I, if I'm not misinterpreting?
Right.
Good.
Okay, so we're after 4:45, so I'm going to turn this over, Anna, to you and to New York City DOE for questions.
Yeah, so real quick before we hand it over to folks for DOE specific questions, of which there are many, same as Tuesday, many questions we didn't get to. We are going to capture those. We're going to roll them forward. We will be back in touch with the sector about our next webinar, which will be either next Tuesday, if not before, and potentially before because of the recent release of the SED guidelines. It really depends on our ability to digest 145 pages of amazing wisdom from our friends at NYSCD, and we thank them for their voluminous and detailed attention to such an important task. I think the only thing, Yomika, that I just want to call out, are we doing like remote high fives here, David? Or are you ready? Okay.
I do want to say one more thing before you go on to the DOE.
Well, I'm not handing it. Not handing it off to the DOE question yet. There's just one question that came through on the chat, which was one that we had extensive conversations related to internally that I think is worth clarifying as people are anticipating diving into portals, which is this idea of being fully remote for the 2020-2021 school year. So that question came up in the chat. And so Yomika, I actually want to, if I could, first kick it to you in terms of the conversation that we had and your understanding of the framing of the DOH guidelines and what, as the association, the framework we're recommending schools to use, and then ask David, Susie, and Laurie to weigh in, because I feel like this is a 50,000 foot thing that is worth touching on before we move on to some stuff that's a little bit more weedy. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Not at all.
Right.
So my read of the DOH guidelines is that they require in-person instruction, no details or requirements on the length, the time, the quantity, etc. But every plan requires in-person instruction, and so that would eliminate, I'll say for the school year at least, the possibility of submitting in the plan that does not have in-person instruction, that is 100% remote instruction. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Just so I understand the question, you're asking what are the...
Could a school submit a plan either to the DOH and or to their authorizer saying, this is our plan is fully remote for the 2021 school year, and we're making that decision / proposal
Yes, yeah.
now.
I know that there's, not to call out a specific school, but I know that Success Academy is, right, Susie? They're fully remote? They're planning to do fully...
Well, I haven't seen their plan yet,
Right.
but that is counter to what I've heard them discuss. But, I've heard other organizations indicate various things since the end of the school year about their timing. At one point, someone talked about doing 6 weeks on and 3 weeks off and 6 weeks on. And so there, I think, still a lot of...
At the risk of interrupting you, Susie, to me, so my understanding of the DOH, so the governor's guidelines in particular, is that they are about return to school, right? So the idea is not like we're the wagon stuck in the mud right now, and let me tell you about the wagon, let me tell you about the mud. It's about how we're getting out of the mud, which means ultimately some children, to some degree, are in person for some amount of time in 2021, as opposed to submitting a plan in particular on the governor's guidelines saying no child will attend school in person for the entirety of the 2021 school year.
Yeah, I'm still not, so my phone is buzzing, there's chats popping up, and I'm trying to listen to what you're saying. So all of the communications are distracting my brain. It is, right now it is possible. We think that most of our schools that we've talked to have a burning desire to get their kiddos back in school, based on many of the conversations and comments that we've already had. And so that's our hope. But it is at this point allowable. What is unclear, and I don't have an answer to this, and I'm pretty sure David doesn't have an answer to this either, is, you know, if the rates of infection stay at very low, hovering around 0, we get through this and it's, you know, February, it may be that I much like you've heard me say about the SUNY trustees, and I never predict what they will do until 2 hours after they have voted. I would never predict what the governor would decide in January about schools. But for now, it's possible, if schools want to submit a plan that leaves them fully remote, for them to do that.
I could not have said it better myself. Ditto. Yeah, I would.
Laurie, any thoughts?
I do hope that schools will consider a hybrid approach, because we know the benefit of in-person instruction. But very briefly looking through the DOH guidance, to me, it does leave room for having remote instruction. And I know of no executive order. Now, this might change tomorrow, but I know of no executive order that prohibits remote only instruction. Keep in mind, you know, can you, you know, are you leaving something on the table if you're not engaged in some hybrid or in-person instruction, particularly for your students with disabilities, English language learners, and other vulnerable populations?
Yeah, my sense is that to agree with David and SED's interpretation, but also would encourage—
I call it the Carello interpretation.
and would also encourage schools to listen to the feedback that you were getting from your communities around making a choice of that magnitude.
That's great, absolutely. So Anjali, Erin, Laurie, Corey, so sorry, we're pushing to get to a handoff earlier than this. Happy to go a little bit long for New York City DOE specific content, but we'll say to everyone again, we're going to capture, like before, all the questions not answered from Tuesday. I think we actually had probably like a 90 or 95% hit rate of questions from Tuesday that weren't answered that we got to today. And so I'm happy to do that again and curate them. And we'll be sure to push out an announcement about a future webinar, potentially as soon as tomorrow, which might be news to our fancy friends here. And if not that, absolutely early next week. So with that, handing it over to New York City friends.
Sure, hi. So I know DOE has a hard stop at 5, so I'm not gonna get into any real specific questions. Obviously, some of them have come up again on the chat today, and we can try to make sure to go through. I'll start with a couple of obvious things that I know people are always going to ask about, which I can see Erin and Anjali are doing in the chat ferociously, which is just DOE calendar is still not out yet. The busing situation, I know that people are asking for updates. I know DOE does not yet have anything to share on that, but will hopefully soon. We did get a question last time about ventilation in DOE buildings. I assume this is mostly for co-located schools. I would just remind everyone that DOE is going to be starting next Wednesday, the office hours at 11 with the facilities team. So I think those types of questions should absolutely go, please go to those office hours. And then I think the last one, which maybe I'll have Anjali do, is about the reconciliation period, which, as David mentioned, he sent out a memo today. And so Anjali, if you maybe just want to talk about the plan for the reconciliation period to open. I know we did not get to any of the questions submitted in the Q&A today. We'll have to get back to you. And obviously, I just want to say that we know there's a lot of kind of interplay between the Department of Health and DOE for a lot of the DOE based, or I should say, a lot of the charter schools based in New York City. We're well aware of that. We have been talking with DOE about how aspects of that plan might be answered, how things are going to play out, and we will absolutely be coming back to you on that. So do not think of this as we have not forgotten that a lot of the plan elements are requiring a lot of coordination with locals. So that would be for New York City charters, that's your, the NYC, DOH, MH, and the DOE. So we will be back to you for sure on more information. So Anjali, if you just want to do really quickly the reconciliation, any updates on the period opening?
Great. Hi, Corey, and hi, everyone. So thank you, David, and thank you to your team for helping us for releasing that memo. At the moment, we are vetting and reviewing that memo that SED released, and we're hoping to open the portal for the reconciliation on Monday. And as we shared before, we are going to give schools their full time to complete the reconciliation. So look out for an email either tonight or a blurb in tonight's C-Weekly or tomorrow with specific information on the portal opening. We'll also be having finance office hours to address any questions that you may have regarding the instructions that we will release. That's all I got, Corey.
Great, thanks. I'll hand it back to you, Mika.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for everyone today, your participation on the call today, and for your patience with the questions. We're trying to keep up as much as possible. As stated earlier, we will try to schedule additional webinars. Stay tuned on that as we send out information on when we can come back together again and continue this and answer more of the good questions, and certainly the New York City DOE specific questions as well. I also want to turn everybody's attention to and remind them of our PPE ordering and buyers discounts. We'll drop that information in the chat for those of you who wanted to participate in some of the collective purchases. If you can send us an email if you have any questions about that. Stay tuned, as I said, for additional webinar information and updates, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.